Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to compare audits and reviews. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, the concern or the reason that I did this module is review standards mirror audit standards. And the danger in that is because the standards are similar, there is a risk that people will interpret them to be the same and say that in a review we have to do the same level of work as we do in an audit. And of course, that's not the case. Now, this comparison is done more from the perspective of a review than from an audit. So I'm comparing things where we do something in a review and we do something similar in an audit to see the differences. And of course, in an audit, there's going to be lots more stuff that we do. Audit standards are much more detailed, much longer than review standards. So this is not complete. It's just the highlights, and it's particularly to compare where the review work effort sounds similar to the audit work effort, but it's in fact quite different. So the objective of a review and the objective of an audit. Well, the level of assurance in an audit is reasonable assurance that the financial statements or the information is free from material misstatements. So that's a high, but not an absolute level of assurance. In a review, it's limited assurance that it's free from material misstatement and done by inquiry and analytical procedures. So significantly less than an audit. 50% assurance, or perhaps less. Not really defined what limited assurance is, but clearly less than an audit. Do we prepare a report? Yes, in both. Do we communicate with the client, those charged with management or whoever as required? Yes, in both. But remember, in a review, we're doing less work, and the review clients are probably less complex than audit clients. So it is less likely that we will come up with something to communicate in a review than in an audit. Do we use professional skepticism and judgment? Yes, in both. And are we to know and comply with all the requirements and the rules of professional conduct code of ethics? Yes, in both. Quality control. Now, it's the same in both, and indeed, I don't think the standard caused a change because the overall quality control standard always required the same level of quality control for all assurance engagements, and audits and reviews are assurance engagements, so it's the same. Overall, it's the same engagement level required. And that's slightly different, I guess, because it's now explicitly required in the section, but I think you could assume it was before. And monitoring now explicitly required for reviews, but I think you could also assume that it was before. Acceptance and continuance, again, that was required by the overall quality control standard, so yes, and it's either similar or the same. If you wish to derive your acceptance and criteria, or acceptance and continuance criteria from the overall quality control standard, then they'll be the same for both. Communication. Do we say that statements are management's responsibility? Yes, in both, and we're to do it in the engagement letter. It's explicit in both standards. Do we tell the client about the timing and scope required in an audit and mentioned in the review engagement letter? Do we tell the client of significant findings? Yes, we do. In an audit, there's a list and items that are identified using the auditor's professional judgment. In a review, it's matters that in the professional judgment of the reviewer are of sufficient importance, which means there are some that you might not report because they were not of sufficient importance. Does independence apply? Yes, it always has. And should we document the communication? It's the same in both standards. The communication may be verbal, but we should write down what we've said verbally if we do so. That's one, by the way, of the overboard things. I've seen people say that in a review you must write a management letter. Well, you don't have to write a management letter. Even in an audit, you can communicate matters verbally. But in both types of engagements, if you do communicate it verbally, you'd make a note in the file. I told the client this. Letters, engagement and representation letters required for both. They're different, similar but different, so have a draft for each. And for both standards, you get an engagement letter before you begin the engagement, and afterwards you decide whether or not you wish to issue an annual reminder. Materiality. Calculation and benchmarks are the same in each. Determine and document for the statements as a whole and revise, yes for both. Document performance materiality, that's only required in an audit. It's not mentioned in a review. And is it a matter of professional judgment? Yes for both. In an audit, there's kind of an implication that we should document any factors. That's not mentioned in a review. The understanding of the client. We should understand the client and the accounting framework used. Yes for both. How do we obtain it? Now, this is a significant difference between audits and reviews. There's a list of required items in the audit. Then we do risk assessment procedures, inquiry, analytical procedures, observation, and inspection. In a review, there's a similar list, not quite as extensive, but similar. But the procedures we do are only inquiry and analytical procedures. And in an audit, we have to understand internal control, and there's a long list, and there's different types and kinds of internal control. In a review, all we have to do is get an understanding of the accounting systems and records. So something like they use the following computerized accounting package and they reconcile the bank monthly, and perhaps that's roughly all you need to know. In an audit, you have to assess risk of material misstatement by assertion and document it. In a review, you document where you considered material misstatement to be likely, which could be, I didn't think material misstatement was likely anywhere. So that documentation would be much simpler. In an audit, even if you thought risk of material misstatement is low everywhere, and sometimes that happens, you would still require documentation of each component, each assertion, and your assessment of risk of material misstatement for each. So much more documentation in an audit, much less in a review. Documenting the understanding. In an audit, we are required to have planning discussions, not a meeting, but discussions. Everybody doesn't have to be there, but you should have it and document it, not required in a review. Is there a list of planning items? What kind of business is it? For instance, that's required in both an audit or review. Slightly shorter list perhaps in a review, but a similar list. In an audit, you have to document the key items of understanding internal control environment, for instance, so that has to be done. In a review, no. Where material misstatement is likely and document, and you don't document in particular anything on internal control. The material misstatement assessment has to be documented by assertion in an audit, and where material misstatement is likely, documented in a review. Risks and related controls, yes in an audit, no in a review. And this is the things that are formally required to be documented in an audit in the documentation section. There's lots of other things that are required to be documented in an audit. Design and perform procedures. Well, there's a long list of procedures in an audit: inspection, observation, analysis, inquiry, confirmation, recomputation, reperformance. In a review, inquiry and analytical procedures only, and more if material misstatement is likely. Purpose: respond to the assessed risk of material misstatement and document how. You've got to loop back and say how the procedures we did responded to the assessed risk of material misstatement. In a review, we address all material items and focus on where material misstatement is likely, so that's a lot less. And are there lists of required procedures, going concern, fraud, all that stuff? Yes, there's an audit style list, And yes, there's a review style list, which is a bit shorter. Other procedures, the same. Initial engagements, we have to come up with audit level satisfaction on the opening numbers. In a review, we have to come up with review level satisfaction on the opening numbers. Reconcile to the records, do more if materially misstated, accumulate misstatements, communicate misstatements. That's a yes in Canada, not in the rest of the world, and conclude. So that's all the same. And documentation. This is the specific documentation section. There's, of course, lots to be documented in an audit, less in a review. Documentation should be timely, yes. Nature, timing, and extent of procedures and results, yes. Significant matters, yes. Who did it and when, yes. Who reviewed and when and the extent of the review, yes in both. So the documentation is very similar. It's just that there's lots of other documentation sections that require documentation in an audit. So read and follow the standard and don't go overboard. So thanks for listening.